There are silences that say more than words ever could, not the comfortable silence between people who have known each other long enough to need nothing said, not the peaceful silence of a room after music has ended, but the silence of a man sitting very still after hearing something that has rearranged the interior architecture of everything he thought he knew about a person, a silence so complete and so heavy that the people in the room with him feel it pressing against their own chests and instinctively stop speaking. That was the silence John Lennon held in the first days of 1971, after Paul McCartney told the world that John had broken up the Beatles. He did not respond immediately. He did not call, he did not pick up the phone and say what he was thinking, and what he was thinking was loud enough to fill a room. He sat with it. He let it settle into the particular shape it was going to take, and then 3 days later he sat down and wrote. What he wrote was not a letter, it was not a statement. It was a song, and then another, and then another, and the songs that came out of those days were among the sharpest, most unguarded, most emotionally exposed things he had ever committed to tape. They sounded like the inside of an argument that had been building for a decade, finally given permission to speak at full volume. But the real story was never only in the music. The real story was in everything that came before, in two boys from Liverpool who found each other at the exact right moment and built something the world had never seen, and then slowly, painfully, inevitably discovered that the thing they had built together had grown larger than the friendship that made it possible. The real story was in the gap between what they meant to each other and what they eventually said about each other in public, in the distance between the first rehearsal and the last courtroom, in everything that was lost between those 2 points that no amount of music, however brilliant, could fully recover. This is that story, not the mythology, not the headline, the story of two people who built a world together and then had to figure out how to exist in the wreckage of it. They met in the summer of 1957 at a church fete in Woolton, Liverpool. John Lennon was 16 years old. He was the leader of a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, performing in a field on a warm July afternoon with the confident looseness of someone who had already decided he was going to be important and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He played banjo and sang and made the whole thing look easy in the way that masks real work, and the people watching could see even then that there was something particular about him, some quality of attention, of aliveness, that set him apart from the other boys on the makeshift stage. Paul McCartney was 15. He had been brought to the fete by a mutual friend and had no particular expectations. He stood and watched the Quarrymen and formed his judgments with the quiet precision that would characterize everything he did creatively for the rest of his life. John was good, Paul could hear it. Paul could also hear the places where John's playing was technically imperfect, the chord shape slightly wrong, the tuning not quite right, and what Paul did with that information said everything about who he was. He filed it away, not as a reason to dismiss what he was seeing, but as a potential contribution, something he could offer. After the performance, Paul was introduced to John backstage. He demonstrated a few chord shapes. He played a song he had written himself, something clean and melodic that landed differently than anything John's own band had been doing. John listened with that particular quality of his total undefended attention and recognized something immediately. Here was a person whose musical instincts were different from his own but equally strong. Here was someone who could do things he could not, and who would therefore make the thing he was building better than he could make it alone. The decision John made in that field in Woolton in 1957 to invite Paul into the Quarrymen, to absorb a potential rival into the inner circle rather than keep him at a competitive distance, was the most consequential artistic decision of the 20th century. Neither of them could have known that then. They were a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old standing in a field in Liverpool, and the whole of what they were about to become was still entirely invisible. But something began there that afternoon, something that would take 12 years to fully break, and longer than that to understand. The partnership that formed between John Lennon and Paul McCartney over the following years was not always easy and was never simple, but it was real in ways that very few creative collaborations ever achieve. They wrote together in the front rooms of each other's houses, guitars across their laps, passing ideas back and forth with a speed and fluency that people who later witnessed it described as almost telepathic. One would start a melody and the other would complete it. One would bring a lyric that was stuck and the other would find the word that unlocked it. They pushed each other, sometimes gently, often not, toward things neither would have reached independently. The dynamic was productive precisely because it was asymmetrical. Paul was technically more accomplished, more naturally melodic, more concerned with the craft of a song as an object to be perfected. John was more instinctive, more willing to leave a rough edge if the edge was true, more interested in what a song was saying than in how cleanly it said it. Left alone, Paul's instincts could tend toward the ornate. Left alone, John's could tend toward the unfinished. Together, they counterbalanced each other in ways that produced music neither would have written separately. I Want to Hold Your Hand, A Hard Day's Night, In My Life, A Day in the Life, Eleanor Rigby. Norwegian Wood, these were not songs written by one person with the other watching. They were genuine collaborations, the product of two distinct musical intelligences in friction with each other, producing heat. But friction over time produces something else as well. By the mid-1960s, the dynamic between them had begun to shift. The Beatles were no longer a band rehearsing in front rooms. They were the most famous group on Earth, and the weight of that fame had reorganized everything, including the relationship between the people carrying it. John was moving inward toward the strange and the questioning and the deliberately imperfect. Paul was moving outward toward the ambitious and the orchestral and the meticulously produced. These were not incompatible directions. SGT. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967, proved that the two visions could coexist in a single record and produce something extraordinary. But coexistence required management, required both of them to subordinate their individual visions to the shared one, and the capacity for that subordination was not infinite. It depleted. And as it depleted, what was left were two people who had grown up together and were now, increasingly, pulling in different directions with the full force of who they had become. The distance that was opening between them was not hatred. That is the important thing to understand, the thing the headline version always misses. It was not even dislike. It was the specific sadness of two people who have been essential to each other discovering that the terms on which they were essential have expired, that the version of themselves that needed what the other provided was being replaced by something new that had different requirements, but neither of them had the language for that or the willingness to use it if they did. And so the distance grew, and the things that were not said accumulated, and then other things began to happen that made the unsaid things harder to say. Yoko Ono's arrival in John's life in 1966 changed the internal geometry of the Beatles in ways that were partly about Yoko and partly not about her at all. John had found someone. Not just a partner, but a collaborator, an artistic equal who engaged with his ideas on a level that went beyond music, who challenged his assumptions and expanded his vocabulary and made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, that his creative instincts were not just valid but actively worth developing in directions that the pop music world could not contain. For the other Beatles and for Paul in particular, Yoko's presence in the studio was disorienting in ways that were difficult to separate from the changes already underway. She was there for sessions. She was there for conversations. She was present in a space that had previously been defined by the four of them, and her presence meant something, though exactly what it meant was hard to articulate without saying things that nobody wanted to say out loud. Paul had his own partner, Linda Eastman, who would become Linda McCartney. The dynamics of how each woman related to the band's work, to its business, to the decisions being made, became another layer of tension over an already complicated structure. The business had become a crisis in its own right. The death of their manager Brian Epstein in 1967 had left the Beatles without the person who had managed their relationships with each other. As much as their relationships with the world, what followed was a series of decisions about management, about money, about the direction of Apple Corps, the company they had founded together, that exposed the different interests and instincts of each member in ways that could not be smoothed over by the shared identity of being a Beatle. John and Paul were on different sides of the central business dispute. The details were complicated. The emotional reality was simple. Two people who had trusted each other completely now found themselves in opposing positions on decisions with enormous financial consequences, and the legal machinery that handles such disputes is specifically designed to transform human relationships into adversarial positions. By 1969, they were in those positions, and when the music stopped, when the decision was finally, irrevocably made. That the Beatles were over, what was left was the question of what story got told about why. In April 1970, Paul McCartney released his first solo album and gave an interview that announced, in effect, that the Beatles were finished. The phrasing was careful, the implication was clear. And the part of the narrative that emerged from it, the part that took hold in the press and in the public imagination and proved nearly impossible to dislodge, was that Yoko Ono had broken up the Beatles, and that John Lennon had allowed it to happen, and that Paul McCartney was the one who had loved the band enough to try to hold it together. John heard this. He absorbed it with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, total, undefended, completely registering the full weight of what was being said. And then he sat with it, 3 days of quiet, 3 days during which, by all accounts, he said almost nothing to anyone about the thing that was occupying every corner of his mind. And then he wrote. What came out was How Do You Sleep? A song so direct in its address, so specific in its references, so clearly aimed at a single person that there was no ambiguity about its target. John had spent years deploying his wit as a shield, wrapping his anger in irony and his hurt in abstraction. This was different. This was the shield dropped. This was the hurt speaking in its own voice, unmediated at full volume. The song accused Paul of producing music that was pleasant and safe and emotionally shallow. It used references that only someone who had lived inside their shared history could understand. It said, without saying it, that John felt betrayed not only by the public narrative, but by what the public narrative revealed about how Paul saw him, how Paul had always seen him, what Paul had been willing to do with their shared story when the moment came to tell it his own way. Recording it in the summer of 1971 at Tittenhurst Park, John had Phil Spector producing, and a room full of musicians and Yoko present and George Harrison playing slide guitar. George, who had his own complicated relationship with the legacy of the band they had all built and lost, lending his instrument to a song aimed at Paul in a gesture whose meaning was not lost on anyone. The song was devastating. It was also, by any honest measure, unfair in places, the way that the things we say in the deepest hurt are unfair, reaching for the sharpest available instrument without full regard for accuracy. John knew this. He said later that he regretted the degree of attack, that the kernel of what he had been feeling was true, but that the delivery had overshot its target. But the delivery was also the point. The delivery was the sound of a man who had been performing reasonableness for years while a wound went untreated, finally stopping the performance. And the wound was not about business. It was not about Yoko. It was not about which of them was the more important Beatle or which version of history was more accurate. It was about something much simpler and much older. It was about Woolton, 1957, about the field and the fate and the decision John had made that afternoon to let someone in, about what it means to trust a person with the most important thing you have ever built, and what it feels like when that trust becomes a site of competition rather than collaboration. John Lennon had loved Paul McCartney. Not only as a collaborator, as a friend, as one of the few people on earth who had been present for the whole thing, the before, the during, and the devastating after. And what the song was really saying, underneath all its sharpness and its specific grievances, was, how could you take that and use it against me? How could you take what we were to each other and make it into a story that serves your version at the expense of mine? That question, never fully answered, never fully healed, was the real wound beneath the music. The years that followed were years of silence between them, not total silence. There were legal communications. There were occasional interviews in which each spoke about the other with carefully measured words, the calibration of every sentence betraying the effort behind it. There were moments when something warmer surfaced. An acknowledgement of shared history, a compliment offered to the other's work through a third party, a gesture that suggested the friendship was not entirely buried, only inaccessible. John moved to New York. His life took the shape that his post-Beatles years would hold. The activism, the bed-ins with Yoko, the protest music, the fight against deportation, the turbulence and the searching and the gradual movement toward something quieter and more private that would culminate in the 5 years of deliberate stillness after Sean was born in 1975. Paul moved forward too. Wings, a string of albums, a touring life that John had stepped away from entirely. The public versions of each of them became more distinct as the years passed. Paul, the melodic optimist, John, the sardonic idealist, as if the qualities they had once balanced in each other were now running unchecked in their separate directions, but the connection was not severed entirely. It ran underground where the deepest things always run. In the late 1970s, there were phone calls, not many, not often, but real ones, the kind where both of them dropped the public versions and spoke like two people who had known each other when they were nobody, who remembered what the other had been before the world decided what they were. Paul spoke later of one call in which John had said he was happy, actually happy, that whatever had been searching inside him for so long had finally found what it was looking for in the quiet of the Dakota and the mornings with Sean. Paul heard something in John's voice that he had not heard in a long time, something settled, something at rest. He did not know that the call was among the last they would have. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota building. Paul McCartney heard the news and said very little publicly in the immediate aftermath. The little he said was awkward, imprecise in the way that genuine shock makes language imprecise, reaching for words that could carry the weight and finding nothing adequate. He was later criticized for it. The criticism was, in a narrow sense, fair. In every meaningful sense, it missed entirely what was actually happening in the man being photographed leaving his house in the days after. What was happening was grief of a specific and irreplaceable kind, the grief of someone who has lost a person they had not yet finished arguing with, not yet finished reconciling with, not yet finished saying the things that the years of distance had made difficult to say. The grief of a friendship that was in the process of being rebuilt when the time ran out. The phone call that had broken the Beatles could not, in the end, break what they had been to each other. It could damage it. It could put it in a box for years. It could make both of them say things in public that were sharper than what they actually believed and felt in private. But it could not dissolve what had formed in a Liverpool field in the summer of 1957, when a 16-year-old had recognized in a 15-year-old something worth letting in. Paul McCartney has spoken about John Lennon across the decades with an honesty that has deepened over time, as the sharpness of the conflict faded and the loss remained. He has described John as irreplaceable, the person who challenged him most and whose absence he has felt most continuously. What he regrets most, he has said, is not the argument or the worst of what was said in it, but the years of distance that could have been shorter, the reconciliation that was happening and then simply stopped. John Lennon's music remains the record of a man always in the process of becoming, incomplete, reaching, finding new approaches to the same essential questions about love and loss and what human beings owe each other. His solo work, from the raw fury of the early 1970s to the settled warmth of double fantasy, traces the arc of someone learning, slowly and imperfectly, to live at peace with his own contradictions. The phone call that broke the Beatles was not a single phone call. It was years of uncommunicated things arriving all at once through the wrong channel. The failure of language between two people who had always understood each other best through music, the only medium where honesty is fully possible, and nothing, not even the most painful truth, has to be said out loud. They made that music together. It still plays. And somewhere inside it you can hear what it sounds like when two people who love each other more than they can say build something out of that love and then lose it, and keep carrying it anyway, in the only way they know how. What do you do when the most important partnership of your life becomes a battlefield? What survives when the friendship that built something extraordinary cannot survive what that something became? The answer is in the music. It was always in the music. Two voices, finding each other across the distance, saying the things that the phone calls never could.